ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Zombie Train. I am your host, Ellis, otherwise known as Train Man. And this week, of course, we're watching our sped-up footage from Under Construction, episode number 74. And this is episode number 292. We're taking a question from 229, posted by David Mitchell, as I have it written down. His name has not changed. And he asks, do you use double-stack intermodal cars? Do we in the present tense? Yes. Actually, they're quite useful these days. They used to be less useful when we didn't have anything to switch modes to. When we had mostly small freighter ships and boxcars and stuff like that using, smaller parcels like crates and barrels and boxes and that sort of thing. Things that could be moved by hand, that made a lot more sense. Even things on pallets were sometimes too much, because if a pallet's too heavy, you're not going to do it with a pallet jack. You need a forklift, and a forklift takes gas most of the time. There were a couple of instances where we did happen across an electric forklift, but we didn't take it with us, because the need for a forklift, we were trying to omit A, and B, the opportunity for that to be the case, they were just so few and far between that we would need a forklift for something. It's not like we were boxing stuff up onto pallets, because we knew what our limitations were when we started moving, really big quantities of supplies. Anyway, but past tense, we did actually use intermodal cars, not for dragging around most of the time, not for double stacking, I should say, not for dragging around with double stacks on them, because clearance issues will come at you out of nowhere. We definitely had a couple of issues where we had tight clearances on the train, and we didn't even have any double-stack cars. Whether that was from very tight tunnels or bridges, or stuff that had partially collapsed and was actually, inducing a limited loading gauge that wasn't initially intended by whoever built the line. One or the other, there were definitely times where we had trouble. A lot of them had to do with, aside from areas where there was debris, or some tight tunnels, which were kind of few and far between, really. Most tunnels by 2012 had really been upgraded for double stacks, at least all major ones. I think the Hoosick was the last, or one of the last ones that didn't. Although I don't believe Moffett was upgraded either. We didn't end up touching any of those. We don't, when I say we use double stacks, I don't necessarily mean we're double stacking stuff. We don't do that as often, just because we have an abundance of cars and not that much freight. And moving around sort of the maximum number of cars lets us be a little bit more flexible. Anyway, so we didn't use double-stack cars as double stacks. There were a couple of instances in my recollection where we on the Zombie Train did take a loaded car, whether that be a double or a single, for a brief distance, mostly just to get it or them, in the case where it was a train of them, which we did do, out of harm's way, out of a major seaport, so that we could basically tear all the crates open and get the stuff inside. Going to a seaport, especially if you were looking for stuff that wasn't perishable, was usually a good decision for us, especially later in the war, because when we had the firepower to take on the zombies, which often there were a great many at a seaport, because they were often in or near major downtown areas, we could get the supplies out of there relatively quickly, as long as they were already loaded up on trains. They weren't the kind of place where you could hang around, necessarily, but there were definitely times where we saw the opportunity and moved in with a larger force to hold and secure a dockyard. But anyway, yeah, I mean, they were just about as useful to us as they are in real life. They're kind of a niche thing, despite the fact that they are all over the place. They are only useful for hauling containers. Unless you're Weibold, actually, because Beta Rail had an interesting use. So, I'm not sure how long this lasted for, but he was telling me about it at one point. They had a bunch of TTX cars, so, well cars, which they had built over built over the wells. I'm not sure if it was wood or metal or what, but they really did a lot of, relatively heavy modifications to their train compared to us on the zombie train. At least external modifications. We did a lot to the insides of our cars. But they had turned these flat cars into a runway, and they couldn't land onto it. Not as far as I know, he certainly didn't mention anything to that effect. But they could take off from it on the go, and he told me instances where they would get lined up on a real straight stretch of track, and the plane would be hooked down on the rear of the train, and they would basically fly it forward towards the train at the combined speed of the train and those 5 or however many TTX cars that there were. I'm not sure if it was just 5, but anyway, it would give the plane enough speed to lift off, and then they would just land it on a highway somewhere and taxi it over. Now, again, I don't know how long that practice persevered for, because A, I am certain that fuel was very hard to get, and B, it's kind of another niche thing, don't you think? I'm not sure if we were having this conversation in Portland or what, but I didn't really get to question him on it, and it's just coming back to me now. Like, by the time we met in Portland, the plane and the flat cars and that was all gone. Like, I never got to witness that. But we did consider bringing it back. I remember this. We did bring it up again, or he brought it up to me again, when we were outfitting the Enterprise, the Zeppelin. Because the Zeppelin, just like the 1930s U.S. Navy Zeppelins, the Akron and the Macon, was actually built as an aircraft carrier. It could carry, I think, it can carry 5 of them, right? It can carry 5 Sparrowhawks, though we usually only keep 4. Actually, sometimes we only keep 2, and then we have these 2 other planes. These are Sparrowhawk 2. They're not the original. They're not a copy of the original. They're just sort of, they take the name. They're reconnaissance planes, and we were using them, or we do use them. I mean, you don't really that much anymore, but we did use them for scouting out large hordes in preparation for battle, and because they're aircraft and they're kind of loud, you could also use them to draw zombies in a particular direction. But we did consider bringing back a couple of mobile runways, at least as takeoff platforms. Again, not as landing platforms, but as takeoff platforms, so that we could station some of these biplanes, which we only had a handful of, around the country, and we could, sort of be nearby with the Zeppelin, and they would be able to take off from one of the major trains. And this was, again, this was sort of woven into some larger conversations about, okay, how are we going to operate the zombie train, incorporate it as a whole. Basically, everything that I'm talking about right now, for the most part, did not happen. There was no, or rather, there are theories about how running this railroad would work did not turn out to be really remotely accurate. We didn't know how to run a railroad. We knew how to run our own trains, and that was that. And so it was a lot of learning by doing, which ended up with a lot of trial and error, but thankfully it was not overly costly trial and error. It wasn't like, hundreds of people died trial and error. It was just like, well, that was inefficient. Let's do it a different way next time. So, it seemed that we were good enough at keeping people alive, just not that great at running a railroad. So, honestly, considering the two alternatives there, I am glad it was that one and not the other one. So we learned how to run a railroad, and in that we realized we did not need to have several roving supply trains which would constantly be out going from place to place, sort of like the zombie train did. And therefore we did not need to have them equipped with roving runways, effectively, to launch biplanes to meet up with the mothership when it was nearby. Again, it crossed our minds. We did start with the roving trains, but that turned out to be kind of useless when we were trying to coordinate something bigger. and the mobile runways thing never materialized. At least not for us. So we did have plenty of uses for double stack cars. Beyond that, the 5 that had been flattened ended up becoming a larger fleet of flat card TTX cars, because you'd be surprised how difficult it is to find a flat car in this day and age, or how difficult it was. Or is now still. We didn't build that many of them. But it was always like we need a flat car, let's just get a TTX car and fill the well. Let's get a stack car and fill in the bottom with something. It's good enough. It's a flat car. It's flat now. The fact that they were overly long and didn't have a lot of great tie-down points was kind of an unfortunate side effect, but we dealt with that. It just led to a lot of spilled loads. Oh well. That was another thing. What else? We did use flat cars because they are well cars, or we did use well cars because they are well cars, for transporting some larger items. We would usually spring for one because it's tough to find like a lowered flat car. It's tough to find a flat car at all, as I just said. We would spring for one if we had to move a really big piece of an engine, like a boiler or something. That would sometimes lead to trouble because they're not designed to hold something that heavy, necessarily. But at least not on the, not in the way that we were using them. Which was just to sort of set it down, or to reinforce the bottom and then set it down in there and hope it didn't break. That led to a lot of issues as well. Minor derailments, that sort of thing. Minor derailments, you call it minor, it'll still set you back several hours more than likely while you get a car back on the track. But anyway, that's that. That was our use of double stack cars. And the containers we ended up using for a lot of things. Again, we're using them for shipping again now. But containers made excellent sort of ramshackle buildings. You show up with a train full of stack cars, and empty containers. If you can get the containers out of the train, which with a bunch of people and some winches and stuff like that, you totally can, and set them down somewhere, you have a relatively weatherproof shelter. They're not really insulated, but they're something. You can shut and lock the doors, and the zombies, aren't going to get in for a long time if you're in danger. You can just get in there to be out of the rain, whatever. They aren't going to come apart on you. It isn't a wooden shack that you threw together with stuff that you scrounged out of the forest. It's a big piece of metal. It's a big tube of metal, and it's pretty good at keeping whatever's inside from getting rained on or snowed on or whatever. We had at least one instance of somebody sealing the doors on one and using it as a raft. Just as an aside, just to throw out there. But that's it. Some of the... I will say the annoyance a lot of the time came from the fact that a lot of the well cars are articulated and we only needed one or two. So then we need to grab, 3 or 6. You have to round up. It's like... It just created problems because now we were shunting around things that were 3 times as long as they needed to be. And occasionally it did lead to us cutting off part of an articulated set and leaving it behind. And when I say cutting off, I mean forcibly removing. So we had, one end that didn't really have a coupler on it, but when we were in really tight spots, it didn't matter so much. When we could only get the engine on one end, didn't matter. So, yeah, we got use out of those cars just like we got use out of any other cars. Their dimensions, however, made them a little bit unique in their applications, but on the whole, wasn't the worst, wasn't the dumbest things that we tried, other than the boat thing. That wasn't us, though. We found that. Nobody on it, unsurprisingly enough. It's not like you have a lot of freeboard or anything to keep you from falling off. Hell, the thing probably, like, rolled over. Probably capsized. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next week. Trainman out. Barbecue.